remembering the life of America's longest living president. Good evening and welcome to Faith Nation for the special edition of Faith Nation in Washington. I'm John Jessup. Well, Jimmy Carter has died at 100 years old. The 39th president helped broker a historic peace deal between Israel and Egypt, but a bad economy and foreign policy failures limited him to one term. As Jennifer Wishon looks back, he might be best remembered for how his Christian faith guided his life after he left the White House.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
When he took the oath of office in 1977, James Earl Carter Jr. brought a breath of fresh air to Washington. A Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher and peanut farmer, the Georgia governor came from nowhere in 1976 to defeat President Gerald Ford. With Carter, many evangelicals were thrilled one of their own made it to the White House. He spoke their language, and there was real hope he could turn the country around. Before the '76 election, he talked to CBN founder Pat Robertson.
My faith in Christ has grown with age and with responsibility.
As president, he faced a world full of danger. The Soviet communist menace lurked on every continent.
The number killed in Tehran since the beginning of the month is probably well over 100.
In Iran, more trouble. A revolution led by an obscure cleric, the Ayatollah Khomeini, turned the country upside down. Suddenly, an ally became an enemy. And in November 1979, Khomeini's followers took 52 Americans hostage. A failed rescue attempt ended in the deaths of 8 U.S. servicemen. Critics say Carter's Iran legacy continues to haunt us today.
Building, building, building. Skyscrapers.
While elected to control surging inflation at home, it grew even more during his term as interest rates soared and Americans lost jobs. The terrible economy haunted the president's re-election campaign. He was challenged by Republican Ronald Reagan, who told Americans it was time to change leaders.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
But as a former president, he drew admiration for his work championing human rights and charitable causes like Habitat for Humanity. Carter told Gordon Robertson it was his way of putting his faith into action.
I think it's important for us to actually do things to demonstrate our belief, as Jesus did his whole life.
The 39th president was happily married to his wife Rosalind for 77 years. The former First Lady, a respected advocate for mental health and human rights, died at age 96 at home in Georgia alongside her husband. Throughout all the battles he faced in life, Carter leaned heavily on his faith.
I think I have been as blessed as any human being in the world.
Jennifer Wishon, CBN News.
Thank you, Jennifer. And here now for more is Chief Political Analyst David Brody. David, a Southern Baptist with humble roots, known for his faith and his fidelity to his wife, Rosalind, who died just last year. David, though, big picture, what legacy does President Carter leave behind?
Well, look, I think you have to start with a disclaimer and the 24-hour asterisk, which is because he just passed away here recently. You know, I think to be harsh would probably be somewhat inappropriate, but he's not going to go down as one of the best presidents for sure. He'll probably go down as one of the worst. And that's the truth from an historian standpoint. If you just look at any top, president's list, he's not there. He's towards the bottom. Look, here's the thing, John, there's a lot to say about him. But the inflation and the economy and the gas prices and the gas lines and all of that, beyond Iran and everything, but it was huge during that time. And because of that, he had a very famous line where he went to the Americans and said, he said, you know, you could just turn down the thermostat. And I think at that point, Americans said, well, don't know about that if that's your solution. And so bottom line is that the historians are going to say one thing about Jimmy Carter, but I think people in real time, Americans living back during that time, rendered their verdict, and that ushered in Ronald Reagan in a landslide.
Yeah, and I think that verdict, as you just pointed out, mostly about his life post-presidency. David, as you well know, the tributes are pouring in. President Biden highlighted him being a man of integrity and highlighting his faith and values. What has President-elect Donald Trump said?
Well, Donald Trump, I guess surprisingly, said something very cordial and nice and above it all, if you will, about Jimmy Carter, saying, look, they may have disagreed on a lot of things, but he was a good man and a Christian man. And so he actually took the high road. So good for him on that. Let me just say one last thing about Jimmy Carter as it relates to his faith. Remember, he won half the evangelical vote in 1976 when he got elected starting in 77. But then that gave rise to what we call the religious right back in the day, because they were not happy with Jimmy Carter whatsoever, specifically as it relates to some things he did with private Christian schools and taking away their tax exemption status. That gave rise to the religious right, and it was a real problem for him. It was a turning point for him during that time.
David, always great to have you. And just a reminder that Jimmy Carter State funeral will be on January 9th. Of course, we will be covering that. CBN Chief Political Analyst David Brody, thank you so much.
You bet.
Well, still to come, there is a shortage of nearly 20 million homes in America. My colleague Jenna Browder joins us to explore the affordable housing crisis and how the church is helping to step in. Next. Well, ever since the Sooner State legalized medical marijuana, investors have been making the trek from mainland China. Chinese backers have bought nearly 2 million acres of Oklahoma farmland. CBN's Tara Merchner reports on the fallout.
Mexican cartels have long dominated the black market marijuana trade in the U.S., but the Chinese have also emerged as significant players, including here in Oklahoma after the state legalized medical marijuana several years ago. Once celebrated for picturesque landscapes, the Oklahoma fields of green that sustained generations of farmers with income.
My mom and dad raised all of us here.
And Americans with food are now a hot real estate commodity, generating international interest.
Welcome to your own piece of paradise. 160 acres of land for sale in northeastern Oklahoma.
Foreign investors, 80% of them Chinese,
they're literally bringing in briefcases full of cash.
Planting roots in the heartland to grow marijuana.
Smells like a dead skunk.
Oklahoma's land rush took off when voters green-lighted medical marijuana in 2018.
Voters approved a medical marijuana proposal on Tuesday, and it's one of the most permissive in the country.
It accelerated 2 years later due to pandemic shutdowns. While other states locked down, Oklahoma opened wide for business. A medical marijuana grower license allows a business to legally grow marijuana for medicinal purposes in Oklahoma, but the number of black market operations is on the rise.
People needed work, and the criminal organizations needed to be able to move their product.
The allure of affordable land, inexpensive licenses, and lax laws combined for an irresistible recipe, turning the breadbasket of America into a pot lover's paradise.
I'm getting letters. They want to buy 54 acres of my land over in Lincoln County. They gave me a price, everything. I won't sell it to them.
While Kingfisher County farmer John Emmerich turns away offers, plenty of others are trading masses of land for fast cash, quickly approaching 2 million acres across the state.
Going after the greed, the money. That's all they're doing.
Drug laws are so lax that they can pretty much do whatever they want.
Since Oklahoma prohibits land sales to non-U.S. citizens,
it wasn't the Chinese bought it. It was some white people, USA people, who did.
Criminals are paying locals or lawyers to buy it for them.
We'll pay you X amount of dollars. You put your name on the grow license. And we're going to grow underneath you.
About half of the state's 6,400 operators are currently under investigation.
Each time we've hit one of those farms, it's really a smaller part of a much bigger investigation, because that farm is oftentimes tied to 40 to 400 other farms in Oklahoma, which are all being run by a higher up group of people that are moving the plants, moving the workers, and more importantly, making the money disappear.
A 2-year license moratorium is in effect as law enforcement struggles to weed out illicit pot growers.
When you've got several thousand grows across the state and you have a team of 6 to 10 people trying to keep up with it, there's just not enough time in the day or in the year for them to do it.
Their investigations widening to include human traffickers and violent crime. This was ruthless execution-style killings.
Correct.
Boom, boom.
Are there other people inside?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the worst cases happening on this 10-acre marijuana farm in Kingfisher County. What led to the execution of 4 Chinese nationals here?
So what we were told about was this was all over money, approximately $300,000. Don't care who they hurt or kill or anything.
Despite problems caused by this medical marijuana boom, supporters insist the cannabis industry is breathing new life into the state.
It's very beneficial, you know, with it boosting our economy.
Still, while shops on almost every corner buzz with business,
Gummy bears, you got vape cartridges, we have pre-roll.
Legal retailers like Brandon Carcho say the shadowy underworld is undercutting business.
They don't have to follow the regulations we have to follow, and they don't have to pay the taxes that we have to pay. It hurts us. It's definitely a risk to buy anything that's illegal. And you don't know what you're getting, you don't know what's going to happen.
5 years into Oklahoma's medical marijuana program, there is growing skepticism about its legitimacy. The state has more cardholders than any other in the country.
The doctor does his appointments virtually, so you don't even have to go anywhere.
Oklahoma law outlines no qualifying conditions for obtaining a card, raising concerns about potential misuse and addiction.
Has Oklahoma, in your opinion, created more drug addicts?
Oh, absolutely. And because of the purity of the marijuana, we're seeing the adverse effects in medical and mental health.
In what many believe is a change of heart, Sooner State voters voted down a plan to also make recreational use legal, even though it would have brought in millions more in tax revenue. Still, it's clear the Wild West of weed is far from being tamed, while the marijuana industry blooms bigger, and Oklahoma farmland quickly disappears.
Is there any turning back for the state at this point?
It's the almighty dollar. We're starting to lose our morals and our values in the efforts of trying to get more money.
About 400,000 Oklahomans participate in the medical marijuana program. That's nearly 10% of the population and the largest number per capita in the country. In Oklahoma City, I'm Tara Mergener, CBN News.
Welcome back. China's long-term investment in African nations is turning the continent into a breadbasket to feed the Chinese. And as CBN's Gary Lane reports, that could result in shortages for the rest of the world.
This new war is happening right now without armies or any shots being fired. It's a global struggle with deadly consequences. Who will dominate the world food supply?
Food is power. We need to remember that, and this is very dangerous for the United States.
Our country's former UN ambassador for food and agriculture, Kip Tom, contends Africa is the new battleground in a conflict over global food dominance.
China wants to seize control of the continent of Africa. And it's not about the mining and the critical minerals. It's about agricultural productivity.
Gatestone Institute China analyst Gordon Chang agrees.
China has a food problem. It's worsening food shortages. Self-sufficiency percentages for food for China are relentlessly falling.
That's why this year ports in Shanghai are reportedly on target to receive 250,000 tons of food from Africa, valued at more than $500 million. The African Union wants to expand trade with Beijing and gain Chinese innovation to help expand long-term food production. Current agricultural technology has helped South Africa and Nigeria become the continent's largest food producers. Ambassador Tom suggests that led to an August visit by Chinese diplomats with Nigerian officials, followed by President Xi Jinping's trip to South Africa for the BRICS conference.
The reality is the Chinese Communist Party goes in through every country in Africa, investing in infrastructure and other projects and actually capturing the country's natural resources. But their ultimate goal is to have Africa be the breadbasket for the country of China to feed their 1.4 billion people.
And, you know, we shouldn't have to worry just about Africa. We should be worrying about the U.S.
A future conflict over Taiwan or tariffs and trade battles could place the U.S. food supply at risk. Threatened regimes often use food as a weapon against their opponents. During the 1990s, the people of South Sudan refused to embrace Islam, and the Khartoum government retaliated by denying them food, causing many to die from starvation. Chang warns Americans should have learned from the COVID pandemic about food scarcity. While U.S. consumers couldn't get meat at grocery stores, the world's top pork producer Chinese-owned Smithfield Foods shipped pork to China. Although Smithfield is not a state-owned company, Chang believes it operated at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party.
It had to do what the party wanted. It shipped pork to China at the great detriment to the United States. So we got a problem at home.
China is also taking steps to lessen its reliance on U.S.-grown food. It's turned to Brazil, making it the top exporter of agricultural products to China, providing 20% of the country's food supply. So what can be done in the short term to strengthen the food security of the United States? Ambassador Tom insists the country needs to increase domestic food production and manufacture its own critical agricultural products like fertilizers and others, rather than getting from adversaries like Russia, Belarus, and China.
This is a wake-up call, and we could be a food power, and we could use it in a manner that benefits the United States, but our friends and allies around the world.
Chang contends China is motivated by the doctrine of Tianxia, the belief the CCP has the right to rule all under heaven and an obligation to do so.
China's tried to dominate food because it wants to rule the world. And so we've got to understand the context of what is occurring and the significance of what is occurring. And we Americans have not been good at doing that. We just ignore what our enemies say. We ignored Osama bin Laden until 9/11. We're ignoring the Chinese now.
Gary Lane, CBN News.
Domination of the South China Sea. It's a major goal of Beijing. Now, fishermen whose livelihoods depend on the waterway are caught in the crosshairs. CBN's George Thomas brings us the story of their struggles firsthand from Manila.
Spend any amount of time with JC Cabanillas on the water, and you'll soon discover what puts a smile on his face.
I feel the happiest when I'm at sea. This is the kind of job where you don't have a boss. It's based on your decision whether you'll go to sea or not.
3 generations of Cabanillas' family have fished these waters here off the Philippine coast. That livelihood now faces an increasing threat from China.
Every time Filipino fishermen go to the West Philippine Sea, they will be greeted by Chinese Coast Guard and Chinese fishermen. No matter how far they are, they will be reminded that you have entered Chinese territory, so you have to leave.
Fernando Haicap runs the nation's largest fishing federation, some 80,000 members. He says that China's claim to South China Sea, including the West Philippine Sea, puts fishermen like Cabanillas on the front lines of a possible military confrontation with Beijing.
Before the occupation of the Chinese government in the West Philippine Sea and larger South China Sea, area used to be a fishing ground for all fishermen from different countries: Malaysians, Indonesians, Vietnamese, Taiwanese, and Chinese. During that time, there were no stories of fights or rivalry between the fishermen. But now, the Chinese presence is so destructive.
The Philippine government warned world leaders at the recent Munich Security Conference that China's harassment of Filipino fishermen and the country's Coast Guard is now a daily occurrence.
It's clear to us what China wants. They want to occupy the West Philippine Sea and the whole South China Sea.
A Chinese Coast Guard ship hit a Philippine Coast Guard vessel last month with a military-grade laser, temporarily blinding some of the crew aboard the Philippine vessel. Several Filipino fishermen were also targeted and forced to move away from the area. The Philippine government lodged more than 200 protests against Chinese intimidation and harassment in 2022 alone.
JC here has been fishing these waters off the coast of the Philippines for more than 35 years. And today, so many of his colleagues who fish these same waters are urging the Filipino government to do more to challenge the Chinese.
To avoid direct military confrontation and still maintain a high level of intimidation, the Chinese government has deployed a maritime militia, mostly made up of commercial Chinese fishermen, to prowl these waters.
They are trained by the PLA Navy, and their wages are funded by the PLA Navy.
Retired Navy Captain Carl Schuster, a former director of operations at the U.S. Pacific Command's Joint Intelligence Center, says the militia has hundreds of commercial boats and thousands of crew members at their disposal.
The advantage of using the maritime militia is ostensibly they are commercial craft. If you check the ownership papers, they go back to a commercial entity somewhere, and that gives the Chinese government plausible deniability.
In 2021, more than 200 Chinese fishing boats converged on the Whitsun Reef, an area under Philippine control in the South China Sea.
Their basic tactics is to intimidate local fishermen into leaving the area so that China gains control of the waters by default.
The militia, dubbed as China's Little Blue Men because of the blue-painted color of their vessels, are trained to carry out offensive maneuvers, especially around disputed territories.
It's called gray zone operations. They stop short of committing an act of war, but they will use their water cannon on local fishing boats. They'll bump them, ram them, sink them, and then leave them.
Experts say China's hybrid warfare here is similar to how Moscow deployed its Russian Little Green Men to infiltrate and take over Crimea in 2014.
And in theory, they could do even more than that. If they ever wanted to launch an attack, they could even use some fishing boats clandestinely or surreptitiously to carry weapons or carry soldiers.
It's one big reason why the Philippines and neighboring countries are reluctant to openly challenge the Chinese on the high seas.
When they come up on one of these craft violating local rules, are they approaching a purely commercial craft or are they approaching an armed ship? Nations, particularly in Southeast Asia, where China is much more powerful than they are, they're very wary of interfering with any Chinese commercial fishing activity for fear of what they might actually be encountering.
Back on his boat, J.C. Cabanillas is thrilled that the United States and the Philippines are strengthening their military ties. Both countries are set to resume joint patrols of the South China Sea.
We Filipinos need to stay strong as well, so that the Chinese will see we're not scared of them. The more we look intimidated, the more they want to occupy us.
George Thomas, CBN News, Manila.
Thank you, George. And that's going to do it for this edition of Faith Nation. Have a great night.